Okay, so we've looked at polygons a little bit. Here we go. And now I want to talk about curves and NURBS geometry. So this object is a geometrical object, but there's also other flavors of this that we can create. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a CV curve. So go to the Create menu, CV Curve tool, and what we'll do now is it gives you this little crosshair. And I'll just turn the grid off real quick. And as I place down points, you'll see that this curve gets created in between the points, or around the points. And I'll hit enter to finish the curve. And there we go. So what this has done is it's taken those points I've placed down, and it's found the average of all of them, and drawn this line around. And if we go into the component modes of this object, you'll see that they're different from what we have with polygons. So we've got this familiar menu now with polygon objects, but you right click on the curve, you have got a couple different things here. Most notably control vertex, and we'll look at hulls too. I'm not going to go into depth with these because we're not going to be focusing on them in the class so much. And same thing with NURBS surfaces, which we'll get to in just a second. But if you go to control vertex, you can see those points you placed down. And if you select one of them and move it around, you'll see that you're influencing that curve now. So this is fundamentally different from how polygons work, because as we've seen with polygon objects, let's zoom in here, we've got discrete points that live right on the surface of this object, and there are linear type lines that are drawn in between them. So you're never going to have a polygon surface that has curvy lines unless you're looking at it with sub D mode, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But a fundamental polygon object like this is always going to be broken up into flat faces with straight lines and very discrete points in space. And that's much different from this object, because it's in this case we're using an averaging mathematical algorithm to draw this line. So as I'm drawing, or as I'm pulling this point around, it's recalculating the average on the fly, and it's redrawing that line, and it's all based on math. And this is based on math too, but this is a little bit more, it's a little bit more utilitarian. That's not the right word. It's a little bit more static, and this is more dynamic. So whereas this is like adding and subtracting, this is more like multiplication and using powers and things like that. I hope that's a good analogy. But hopefully that makes sense. So this is always going to be a fundamentally curved surface. Now you notice that it does look a little faceted when you zoom in to it, but that's just a convenience for the sake of the program. In actuality, this is a perfectly smooth, curved line. If we were to render this, which we can't render a curve, but if we were to look at its real resolution, it would be infinitely smooth, which is part of the reason why it's shown in a preview form like this, because if it were infinitely smooth, then your computer would be working very hard just to draw a simple curve, when in actuality, when we're working like this, we only need an approximation. So those are curves. These are control vertexes. And then we also have hulls. And a hull is just sort of a way of showing you the path of the curve. We can select it and it grabs the entire thing at once. This will be more relevant with NURBS surfaces, which we'll get into right now. So if you go up to the Create menu again, in this case go to NURBS primitives, and let's just create a torus. So kind of like the polygon torus, except this one is built out of curves, is the simplest way to explain it. So its fundamental building blocks are this same curve algorithm. So if we go into this object real quick and look at its components, you can see we've got control vertexes again, just like we did with the curve. We've also got some other things here though, but we also have hulls. So go with the control vertex, and now we can move this around, and you can see that the surface is updating on the fly, just like the curve was. So this is a mathematically derived surface, we could say. You can grab more of these if you want, and really start playing with the shape. But the interesting thing about this is that this surface is always going to be perfectly smooth. And I'll show you that when we render it, because we can see there's facets here. But again, that's just a convenience for the computer to not completely slow down and crash every time you create one of these surfaces. If you can imagine this being perfectly smooth, it would take your entire computer's processor just to display it once. Okay, and so we've also got hulls. In this case, you can grab one of these, and it's kind of like just grabbing an entire edge with polygons. You can scale these up or down if you want. And you can really change the shape of this stuff. So again, I'm just showing you these types of geometry sort of as a way of being a complete instruction about geometry in Maya, but we're mainly going to be focusing on polygons in this class. And the reason for that is because that's mainly what the industry focuses on. And I'm talking about video games, the film industry, both animation and visual effects, and TV shows and what have you. Almost all the software packages are now built around this type of geometry. You can still use NURBS, and people have created very complex and detailed and beautiful models with them. But there's a couple things about them that make them limiting for complex modeling, which I'm not going to spend too much time talking about right now. But just take it on faith that this type of geometry, although it has its uses, are not going to be our primary tools. And they're not going to be the primary tools you'll run into in the industry either. But we will be using curves to create some things. Also, this type of geometry, when it was first invented, I guess you could say, was looked at as perhaps the next best thing or the next great thing that should be adopted in the industry. And a lot of studios did adopt the NURBS geometry for a while, and then I don't know exactly when it sort of dropped out of favor. Probably the late 90s, I think, that polygons started becoming more mainstream. But these days, you don't see really almost any studios using this stuff. But it is there. It does have its uses in certain situations. If we run into a situation in this class, I'll be happy to show you more about this type of geometry. But for now, we can just get rid of it. I did want to show you something really quickly, though, with the curve. If we duplicate this curve, and I'm going to use a new hotkey now, Control D, that'll duplicate it. So I'll just undo that really quick. So I've got my curve here. I'll just hit Control D and duplicate it. And there's now a copy of it sitting right on top of itself. So I can drag that off. And now you can see I've got curve 1 and curve 2. If you grab both curves and you go into the Surfaces menu, which I'll open up with the hotbox, and it's right here for me, Surfaces. I'll just tear off this menu so we can have this open to us. I'm going to create a loft. And what that's done is it's drawn NURBS geometry between the two curves. And this is interesting because the loft has a couple of attributes we can manipulate. I can add some spans here. This is kind of like a polygon primitive. But the cool thing is that I can now take these curves and I can dynamically change the shape of that object that was created. And the reason this works is because, as I mentioned before, Maya is a history-based program. So this surface is linked through history with these two curves. And so as I manipulate the curves, it's going to update. Now there is a way I can break this, so to say. If I grab the surface and I go to the Edit menu, I'm going to delete history. I've got it on a hotkey, so I hardly ever go up here. Let's see. Delete all by type, history. And so now what I've done is I've said, okay, I want you to sever those connections with those two curves and be your own independent object. So now if I grab one of these curves and start moving around the point, I won't be influencing that anymore because they're no longer connected. So that's a loft. What we can do, since we're not really using NURBS geometry in this class, is we can have this spit out a polygon object instead. So I'm going to go into the options for this tool, which is this little box right here. And you'll see these little boxes on a lot of things in Maya. So whenever you see this, it means there's more options you can toggle with this tool and how it works. Okay, so instead of using NURBS, this is an acronym by the way, non-uniform rational B-spline. That's what that stands for. But anyway, we can go straight to polygons. And let's see. A couple things I want to change here. Instead of creating triangle faces, you remember a face is one of these guys right here. We want to use quads. And let's give this a go. So I'm going to select both of these again. And by the way, this little thing I just drew, if you use the left mouse button and just drag in the 3D window, it creates this box, which is a marquee. And anything that you put inside this box as you draw it will become selected. Okay, let's just hit apply. Okay, that's not exactly what I wanted. Let's get rid of that. General, that's right. And we want to change this to per span number of isoparms and go down to 1. There we go. So this has created a polygon surface now, just like this cube, and it's drawn it between these two curves. And so what it's done is it has created a span for each of the vertices I placed down initially. So we could make this a little bit higher res if we wanted to by changing this. So in this case, it's going to say, okay, I want you to build 3 edges for each of those points, and use this curve, which is mathematically derived still, to draw it. So we get something a little bit nicer looking. And we can keep going with this too if we want. Get something really sinuous. Now, even though this is a polygon object, it's still linked by history to these curves. So we can still change how this looks, which is pretty fun. I'm going to go into wireframe on shaded mode, just so we can see these in action. So anyway, those are curves and those are NURBS surfaces in Maya. And I'm not sure that we're going to be using them too much, but when we do, I'll definitely go into detail about how you create and manipulate them. But really this whole video is just to show you that these things exist and they're in Maya. Even though we're going to be using polygons for the most part, it's still good to know about those extra options, extra types of geometry. And I do think we will use the curves now and again.